What's up, everybody? It's Brandon here with the REsimpli podcast, and I want to welcome our guest, Ramon Vazquez. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for hopping on and talking real estate today. Why don't you take a couple minutes and introduce yourself and let us know kind of where you're from and what you got going on?
Yeah, so I'm out of Kansas City, Missouri. Not originally from here, but this is where my wife is from, so that's how I ended up in the Midwest. Met her in California, so made that transition. But this is where we started buying our first rental, and so went from that and transitioned into a full-time investor starting in 2018. And so now this is our primary market, and we're also doing a little bit in Wichita and growing that market as well.
Awesome. So you were living in California looking to buy rentals, I'm assuming?
Yeah, so I was active duty military when I moved to California, and then I met my wife, and then we eventually got married several years later, and we both were making good income. I knew eventually I figured out through Bigger Pockets and some other podcasts that I wanted to start investing in real estate. And that's kind of what led me to figuring out okay, it's hard to find a cash flowing asset in Southern California. So I started looking at other markets, and naturally I looked at Kansas City since we visited there quite a bit to visit her family, and the numbers made sense. So that's kind of how we picked that market. And, even though we wouldn't move there for several years, we would just invest remotely, since it seemed like, a bunch of other people were doing it. And if they could do it, I figured I could learn it too. So
Yeah. Well, thank you for your service.
oh, thank you. Yeah.
And the cash flow is a little bit different in California than Kansas City.
Yep.
And one thing cool about Kansas City is you can get some appreciation, and you can also, there's pockets that are really good for cash flows. So you can kind of buy houses that potentially have both, because not all cash flow city, or not all cities that rent well, the values don't really go up a ton.
Yeah, 100% agree. And it's been exaggerated with all the inflation for sure. So yeah, everything that I bought, in 18, 19, 20, all that stuff has gone up way more than I think it should have. But that's just is what it is. And you're right, all of it was cash flowing in the meantime, just because pricing is affordable and you can kind of hit that 1% rule pretty easily.
Yeah, that's awesome. And so you started buying remotely. Talk about some of the challenges of finding.
Yeah.
Were you renovating these? Were you buying turnkey? What was the strategy of out of state investing?
Yeah. So I read the Burr books, and that's kind of what I wanted to do initially. And I did get impatient. I think that's the hard part about being a virtual investor. You need to build out a really solid team in order to find something that you can add value and then refinance and pull out all, if not most, of your money. So, while I was looking at those deals, I was looking at just multifamily in general. And the first deal I bought was a turnkey, duplex, but it was in a great area. And at the time, it was on the MLS too, and I was using an agent. So at the time, we ended up paying a little bit over asking, which I was like, dang, this doesn't feel like it's a great deal. I look back now, that's one of my favorite assets, just because, locked in super low interest rates, and it's in a great area. I think, you really can't go wrong there if you plan on being a long-term buy and hold investor. Where you can get in trouble is buying in not so great areas where you're speculating a little bit, and maybe the cash flow looks better, because I've done that, and then you realize the tenants are not great. And so those properties require a lot more reserves, even with a long-term mindset.
Yeah, because a bad turn can wipe out cash flow for a while on a rental.
Yep, I agree.
Yeah. So, all right. So your first one you bought was turnkey. Did you attempt to try to renovate and do some value add over the next couple of years, or most of them kind of fell in that same?
Yeah. So the first, and they were all duplexes. The first,
Oh, nice.
Yeah, the first 6 I bought, and I partnered with some with my mom, and obviously my wife, her and I were buying stuff together too. So the last few that we bought were some value add. I was buying them at a discount, but my plan was to do a long-term like possibly renovated over the next year or two as I got tenants out, increased rents and all that other stuff. Well,
Yeah.
that was like during COVID. And so by the time and I'm still kind of working on those a little bit, if I'm being honest, but by the time I got those to where I could refi them, the rates have gone up. So it's almost no point of me refining to try to, replace a 4% interest rate with like a 7.5 or something higher. So right now I'm actively working and seeing if I can get maybe a line of credit on it, which is a little tough because it's multifamily. And so I figured that those are a little bit harder to get a line of credit. But in the meantime, they still cash flow okay. Again, it's a constant struggle with those tenants being replaced. But no, my first I guess it would be 12 units or doors, I should say. They were mostly turnkey. They had tenants in place and they needed very minor upgrades.
Nice. I mean, that can make it a little bit easier being out of state, not having to,
Yep.
do renovations, necessarily start screening tenants, because you buy a house and it takes 4 or 5 months to get it renovated, get it on the market, and get it rented out. I mean, that's
Yep.
mortgage payments you're paying.
Yeah. And I relied a lot on my property manager too, which that's a whole nother conversation too. I've been through 4 property managers now, and I only started in 2018. So, not all of them were fired. One of them quit because she ended up selling her business. But,
Yeah.
it's tough because, you try to go for the cheapest if you're like me when you're getting started to save money, and then you quickly realize, okay, that's why they only charge 7%. And so it's a constant, growing process. And, some of them get too big. That's what happened with the next one after that. And they just didn't, they weren't able to fill them as well. And they weren't providing the level of service that I think you should provide. And so it's a constant balance. My recommendation would be get as many referrals as possible, but also don't be afraid to fire them if they're not doing what you think they should be doing.
Yeah, it's one thing I've always found interesting about the property management industry is it's, in my opinion, and I get it because you only have so much room for cash flow, but the lower the rent, the less the property manager gets paid, and generally the more difficult the tenant.
Yeah, 100%.
Where the opposite can happen, where you can have a higher price rent, usually a better qualified tenant, and they make more money.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's always been an interesting balance to kind of see how it works with. And I don't know what your averages are, but when I have buy and holds in Augusta, Georgia, and they would rent for $800, so paying somebody 9-10%, they're making $80 a month to potentially deal with a headache. It definitely, and then there's a balance. They have to have so many properties to make money.
Yeah.
So I've always found that industry interesting, the kind of way it's all shaped up. So
Yeah, I've quickly realized that one, I needed it out of necessity when I was living out of state. But even once I moved here back to where I could self-manage, it just wasn't what I liked. And I know it was tough. So I feel for all the property managers. Like I try to actually give them a lot of slack because it is one of the hardest things, I think, as a buy and hold investor, is good property management.
yeah,
But you're absolutely right. Like here, the minute you go under $1,000 a month, the quality of that tenant most likely drops significantly. And then, like you said, what they're making isn't a lot. And so they're typically charging you for everything else because they have to cover their costs. You just have to kind of know what you're getting into. And I would just be very cautious if somebody's like, oh, I'll manage it for 7% and, take care of everything. Cause I feel like they're cutting corners somewhere.
yeah,
Just to, break even. Cause it's not a super profitable business unless, like you said, you have a lot of doors and then you run the risk that they're too big. Like the company I had that I ended up letting go, they had over 1,000 doors and it got just too crazy,
yeah,
in my opinion. Yeah.
yeah. The nice thing about it, if you build up enough of your own units, depending on what you're paying, you can eventually probably hire an employee that only works for you. Is one of the cool things. You got to get to enough doors to where you're paying $4,000 or $5,000 a month to a property manager. But then at that point, you can pay somebody $60,000 a year, and then their only focus is door rentals. So that is one of the benefits as you grow. And I've had a couple friends that have eventually, once they got to 50, 60, 70 doors as rentals, they just brought that person in-house and hired them. So then they have one focus.
Yeah, I agree.
Cool deal. So you got your stuff, or you bought your assets in Kansas City or in California. When did you eventually come to Kansas City? And then on that move, did you go full-time investor, or were you still had a job in Kansas City?
Yeah, so right after the pandemic hit, my wife got an opportunity to work for the military in Fort Leavenworth, which is just north of Kansas City.
Okay.
And so that's when we both, like, she had to leave her W-2, a government job, which we were actually both working at a government job in California. So again, we were both making, six-figure salaries, had a ton of benefits because of the government. And she's definitely like more conservative as far as risk goes than I am. And so she was just like, I'm not gonna leave this job just because of all the benefits. And then she's also in the Navy Reserves. And so she got that opportunity. The Navy was gonna pay for us to move. We just said like, hey, let's just move and not move back. They'll hold her job. But at the end of the day, when she's like, hey, I don't want to move back, they're probably gonna tell her like, okay, well, we're gonna let your job go. And so she was even comfortable saying, well, I'll find something, I'll make it work. And that's when once we got that news, I was like, all right, let me go get my license in Kansas City or Kansas and Missouri. And then I could just go be an agent if I can't go full time and just have that to supplement my income. So when we did move, I went into that role of like, hey, let me go be an investor agent. I did, probably, I can't remember now, 20 some plus deals in like 6 months with out of state investors as a brand new agent. But I've been an investor, and I think that's what made me successful. But then I quickly realized that to be a good agent, like, it's a full-time job. And so that was
Yep.
taking me away from what I wanted to personally do with my, real estate investing. And the company that I, ended up forming a few months prior with one of my partners that I met out of Wichita, who was kind of trying to do the same thing as me, become a full-time investor, do some wholesaling, fix and flip, but mostly, build a portfolio. So that was a challenge, and it took me a while to just be like, hey, I need to make that leap and just believe in myself that if I put more time into the business, it's going to be a real business, instead of trying to be an agent, which I got burnt out because I was servicing way too many out-of-state clients, and it was frustrating. Agents will understand and relate. Like, you only have so much control, right? Like, at the end of the day, somebody else is making that decision on whether they're going to buy or sell. When you're an investor, you can make those decisions for yourself. Like, will you buy it? If not, move on to the next deal and whatnot. So made that leap about 6 months later, and went full time. And again, it's easy when you have income coming in from a spouse,
Yeah.
to make that leap, for sure. Or if you have enough, reserves. And we were always savers. That's kind of just been our mentality and why we've been able to purchase real estate. We just save a lot of our income. So that also helped too. Like, we had a bunch of money saved up, and even though we were buying a new house here, we're like, we'll make it work, just because, we know how to save and we know how to live below our means.
Yeah. Which is really important for, any business, but especially if your primary focus is buy and hold, because, it can be very cash intensive on repairs or down payments if you're purchasing and things like that. So did you start wholesaling or doing some stuff kind of to have some active income in the real estate space outside of an agent?
Yeah, actually, I started wholesaling in 2020. So before we even moved, I was virtually wholesaling,
Oh, cool.
but not very consistently. It was like, doing one or two deals, a month, maybe less, just depending, because it was kind of, I'm still kind of figuring it out. I was cold calling and doing some texting and whatnot. And so that was my, once I bought those duplexes, I was like, I need more capital. And that's when I gave wholesaling, a real thought, and went, completely into it and figuring out, okay, how do you wholesale properly? I joined a mentorship, which is where I met my partner, to try to figure out, like, how do you do this right and how do you scale it? And so, once I moved here, I'm doing the agent thing and putting the wholesaling thing kind of on pause, or not doing it as well, I should say. And my partner was also a W-2 working full time, and he was, we were trying to run this business pretty much part time, after our working day or whatnot. And
Yeah.
so, you know, fast forward those 6 months after I was doing that agent stuff full time, I kind of put a break on that. Wasn't super active on it, and we started focusing on that. And then we started doing 2 to 3 deals consistently a month. And so we would try to keep what we could, but at that point we were building the business, so it was putting cash back in. So we were wholesaling a lot more, and eventually, fast forward to today, we're doing a little bit of everything. Still wholesaling to build up that capital and keep the marketing going, and then keeping the deals that we like that still cash flow given today's market and where interest rates are at, and then flipping the stuff that doesn't cash flow, and that's just mostly the best exit to maximize the profit is flip the higher end stuff.
Gotcha. So you're wholesaling with a goal to just pay for marketing, maybe give you guys a little bit of pay as far as ownership, right, and then anything left over is solely focused on putting towards buy and hold.
Yeah.
Are you buying and holding in both markets, or just Kansas City specifically right now?
Right now we have, everything we hold as a company is in Kansas City or the metro. We would buy and hold in Wichita because we know that market a little bit better now. We just haven't found the right opportunity. We've done a flip there and a couple other wholesale deals, but right now we're still, looking for those better, because again, we're trying to hold things in like B- or better neighborhoods, which can be hard to find stuff that cash flows or even deals that make sense. And again, the stuff we're holding right now, it's a true burr. We've gotten to the point where we have the right contractors in place. We know how to do rehabs. We know how to estimate. Like, that took several years to figure out. And so for us, we're not trying to leave money in a deal. Like, we underwrite all our deals where we have zero or we're actually getting some money back, and it still cash flows, and it's in those good areas. So those deals are a little bit harder to find. But we have been adding, around one property a quarter right now is kind of our pace, and trying to scale that up, but mostly single family, which is, a little bit harder to scale doors just because you got to go find more of them than if you found like, one apartment building or something like that. Yeah. But it's what we know and how we market to get those wholesale deals. So it's just easy at this point.
Yeah, for sure. I always find this interesting. Every buy and hold investor is a little bit different. Is your focus to get the houses paid off, or a certain percentage of them paid off and leave them paid off? Or is your goal to then maybe pull out a line of credit to then start snowballing the mortgages to get them? One of my friends, and the reason I asked, one of my friends in Alabama who built up a portfolio of probably 300 homes, said the key was he bought his first one, aggressively paid it off as fast as possible, went and got a line of credit or a mortgage on it, then was able to buy two, and then he had two doors paying one mortgage, and then kind of snowballed and grew. Is that like, what's y'all's strategy as you continue to go?
So our strategy is obviously through the BRRRR method is we're able to leave a decent amount of equity, right? But we are trying to highly leverage our capital just because we can find more opportunities that make sense. And so we're pretty aggressive. And I think that probably goes with the nature of, like, we're all under 40. So like we have a longer investment horizon at this point. So we're not as aggressive as paying them down, but making sure we have cash reserves and they're all cash flowing really well. And then, yes, eventually I think we would take out, and I mean, we've already applied for some and have some. They're okay. They're not like traditional lines of credit. They're more like commercial ones where you can, use that. And again, we would use that to fund these rehabs so that we can refinance out and not have to use hard money on the front. And that's kind of something we're working on now very aggressively, is how do we replace our hard money with private money or other lines of credit where we can do stuff for cheaper than paying, 2-3 points and 12% to a hard money lender, which, there's a time and place for those, but it gets expensive and adds up quick.
It does. Yeah. And I think you're doing it right the way, is take little pieces away. So I'm primarily a flipper, and we used to use hard money for the whole thing. Mm-hmm. Now we just use hard money for the purchase. And our goal is to continue to dwindle that away, so that, I think our main lender is like 12.5 and 2 points. it's not, we're at a point now where they fund 100% purchase, 100% rehab. So it's really
Yep,
nice. But
exactly.
if you can get it a little bit cheaper or, kind of start working that way,
Yeah.
it starts saving money in the long run.
Makes you more aggressive too when you offer, which is always like you're always trying to find a competitor, especially if you're flipping, because there's a ton of people trying to do it.
Yeah.
And I always wonder, like, how are you offering so much more than us? And again, you're either doing it for cheaper than we are, or you have access to a lot cheaper capital. And or you're just, you're not really good at running your numbers. But I like to think a lot of people are at this point that we
Yeah.
compete with, because they've been in the business for a while. So yeah, that's something that we know. We've been doing quite a few deals. We have a lot of folks who follow us and understand and trust what we're doing. And so we just need to tap into that, money that's out there available. And like you said, try to cover part of it, if not the whole thing, when possible.
Yep. So let's talk about the transition. Do you have any tips for somebody looking to transition, some stuff that helped you? Obviously having a good job and having
Yeah.
reserves is a benefit, but not everybody has that opportunity necessarily. So
Sure.
is there any kind of advice or tips you have for that?
I think for me was, you have to kind of look into the mirror and figure out, like, how serious you're going to take this. Do you feel like it's going to be a business that, will make you excited? For me, it was very easy. I was making good money, not excited, and was really bored. So I'm like, real estate was something I was passionate about. So I knew, like, I wouldn't quit, within 2 months, because I got frustrated. Like, for me, I was like, I'm gonna make this work. There's hundreds of people doing it. So if you don't have the benefit of like cash reserves or a spouse that has an income, like, figure out what you need to do to cover those basic living expenses, so that you're not, for lack of a better word, desperate when you're trying to do this business and make offers and talk to sellers. I think, if you come at it from a scarcity mindset because you need a deal today or yesterday, then I think that does impede you. So I would figure out, like, what can I do to supplement that, cost of living that I need for my basic necessities. So it might be, get a job on the side and still try to devote, as much time as you can to your real estate business. For me, that's what I was doing. I was doing them in tandem. And I could see that if I put more time to it, I was probably going to make more money. Right. And so to me, consistency is a big deal. So making sure you have processes in place to be consistent is huge. And I'm one of those folks that would want to do it for at least 6 months, because I feel like you can do it for a month and get lucky and do a deal really quickly. And then that becomes your expectation. And that's also not realistic. Or you could do it for 3 months and nothing happens. And that's okay, because that happens to a lot of folks. Like, it took me almost 3 months to do my first wholesale deal. And then once you do the first one, you're like, okay, wholesaling is real. It's not something that somebody made up or it's something illegal. So you got to be consistent, and you got to figure out which strategy makes the most sense for you. If you just like to buy and hold and like your W-2 job, like, that's perfectly fine too. Like, use that, leverage that. I mean, loans are way easier to get when you have a W-2 job. I know that from personal experience. So there's pros and cons to each one.
Yeah.
For me, was like, I don't have a ceiling if I work for myself. That's always been my thing. And I didn't want to have regret looking back. And if I did 20 years with the government and I had a pension, sure, I'd be fine for the rest of my life. But I probably would be like, hey, what if, right? What if I would have took that leap? So just be consistent. Try it for, I think, at least 6 months before you make any like rash decisions, and figure out what's that one strategy that you want to focus on. Don't try to do multiple strategies. I tried that at one point and it's just very difficult. Like, if you really like fix and flip, maybe just try to be a good flipper first before you try to wholesale or do buy and holds or whatnot. And I think once you get really good at that, you can systematize it before you go on to a different strategy. So I kind of, I went from buy and hold to mostly focusing on wholesaling, and then focusing back on, okay, now I can take these wholesale deals and figure out how to, leverage them to get the max profit, whether it be hold them long term or flip them. It's nice to have those options when you wholesale, but I think wholesaling, it's like, I mean, it's like a full marketing business in itself.
Yeah.
And I think folks are like, I'm just going to try wholesaling for a few weeks and see how. And I'm like, no, don't do that. You're going to get frustrated. And,
Yeah.
there's plenty of people making way more money than me, and they don't they don't market to any sellers. They just network and buy deals from other wholesalers. So everybody has a place, I think, in the industry. You just got to figure out what fits with you and what makes the most sense.
No, I agree with you. You're really spot on. Like your first as a cold caller or direct mail or anything, literally your first phone call can result in a deal.
Yeah.
It's that it can be that simple, or it can be the complete opposite,
Yeah.
where you send thousands of postcards or make thousands of phone calls and they lead to nothing.
Yeah.
And so definitely trying to do it for 6 months or so, and just kind of understanding what the pace of it's like, what it's like, and then focus on your budget. If you
Yeah.
did you started cold calling, is that kind of where you?
Yeah, yeah. So that's a great point. Like not only your personal living budget, but like your business budget. Like
Yeah,
we have progressively gotten bigger. Like we didn't go from like $100 to $10,000. Like our overhead now is over 10 grand, but it was gradual. Like we were at 1,500, then 3,000. Like we were cold calling. I was cold calling myself. Then I met my partner. We brought in a VA. We leveraged that. Then we added texting. It's kind of been layered, and we did start with the cheapest forms of marketing because the risk is lower, right? Like you don't have to blow through $10,000 in like pay per click or direct mail ad spend in a month. You can use $10,000 over 6 months if you're doing it,
yeah.
yourself or whatnot. And so I'm with you. Like do it slowly and just put that back into the business if you can. And it is a struggle at first because like we weren't pulling money out of the business for I think the first year because it was just going right back into more marketing and leveraging other people. And so, for us, it was okay because we had other jobs during that first year. And so we were okay. If that's not you, you got to figure out, what makes sense. And again, you might also want to pick a market where it's more conducive to whatever strategy you're doing, right? Like if you want really big checks and you won't want to do as many deals, like I would say don't go to the Midwest because the assignment fees are not going to be as high as maybe the coastal markets. But understand the coastal markets, it's more competitive, and so you're not going to get as many deals. So some people, I've heard, I think it was Lauren Hardy say this, like, do you like to hunt squirrels or elephants, right? And so that's
Yeah.
also like a personality thing. At the end of the day, I think look at your back market if you can. I think it's always easiest when you're local. But then if you want to go virtual, figure out like one where you actually want to hold things long term. That's probably a good market to start in if you're going to do wholesaling because that can lead you to better deals. But for me, having more deals consistently is more. I guess it's easier for me to predict cash flow and income for the business that way than sure, maybe we could do like a $60,000 deal in SoCal, but maybe is it going to be like once a quarter or is it going to be, once a month versus doing like 4 to 5 deals a month consistently, which is kind of where we've gotten to that point and it's a little bit easier to predict cash flow and kind of grow slowly. That's kind of been our motto.
I think I like the hunting squirrels or elephants. I haven't heard that one, I'm a coastal market, so I live in Charleston, South Carolina,
Okay. Yeah.
and when I first started in the industry, I was in Augusta, Georgia, and two completely different price points.
Right.
And to your point, the assignment fees in Augusta were a lot smaller, but they were a lot easier to get. I
Yeah.
found deal flow to be more consistent, where Charleston, generally, if we assign one or flip one or do something with it, there's more profit tied to it, but we don't get as many of them. And so it's balancing that. And even a $25,000 assignment, yes, it is the proof of concept. Wholesaling works. It's real. It's not illegal, but that can go really quickly if
Yeah.
it's your only deal and you don't have more things coming in with marketing, with depending on your own budget to live, whatever's going on.
Yeah.
25 grand doesn't go a long way potentially. Let's talk about how you decide your wholesale from your buy and hold. So you're doing most of your lead gen. Are you still buying from wholesalers, or do you pretty much buy just from your own marketing?
No, we actually do. We still
Okay.
do kind of all the free stuff that I call like network with agents. We look at wholesale deals. It's harder for me to pencil a wholesaler deal just
Yeah.
because, we can get our deals a little bit cheaper, but they still exist, and
Yeah.
we love to joint venture with wholesalers in our market too, if they maybe have a hard time moving a deal or they need help underwriting and stuff like that. So I guess to your question, like how do we determine what to do with it? So for us, based on the current interest rates and kind of what we're refinancing into, which is a DSCR type of loan,
Yep.
which is based on, debt service and cash flow. We
And
typically,
so people can understand that may not a
yeah,
debt service, basically the rent has to cover the mortgage by a certain percentage. What DSCR are you seeing or underwriting for?
yeah, right now our lender does 1.2.
Okay.
So I think that's pretty common
It
for,
is.
yeah, for single family. So, and then we're getting up, 75% loan to value. And, we can actually do a cash out and the rate goes up a little bit, so we kind of see if there's enough, meat on the bone there to do a cash out and get some money back. But those rates are like, they were hovering in the 7.5 range, plus or minus some percentage. So for us to make it worth it for a cash flow perspective, the minute the after repair value is like over 240, it just doesn't really make a lot of sense. And so the minute we see a property that, and again, we're not taking stuff down that needs like, a 6-figure rehab. We
Yeah.
wholesale those because we have that opportunity. So we're looking for stuff that's pretty straightforward. Or if it needs a big rehab, we're buying it super deep. Like we have one under contract now at 25, and the house is worth 140, but it needs like 65 or 70, I think. And so like that's not a typical deal for us. Typically our rehabs are like under 60. They're usually like, the stuff that's easy to rent, 3.2s, with a garage preferably, and they usually rent for, 1250 plus. But again, the rents don't usually match or make sense with the after repair values once you get over 240. So that's kind of been our sweet spot, which again puts us in like B minus neighborhoods, maybe C plus, like those kind of fringe neighborhoods, which we're okay with, because
Yeah.
we understand, and actually within our business, one of our partners actually does property management. So we have that luxury of like being more hands-on instead of leveraging out to somebody else. So with that being said, if the property is like 350 is the after repair value, we're most likely going to flip that or wholesale it to somebody else who wants to flip it. And then again, if it's turnkey and we really can't pull our money out because we can't buy it steep enough, we'll wholesale those as well if we can. Or, we were selling some of those to hedge funds a year ago when they were buying like crazy.
Yeah.
So we try to look at the exit strategy that makes sense and see what's the best return for our investment. Obviously we can't hold everything because we don't want to kill the wholesale business and not have
Yeah.
a bunch of assignments coming in, even though we could assign it to ourselves in theory. But in every deal that doesn't necessarily make sense. So we have a very specific criteria. So a lot of the stuff that we get under contract doesn't meet it. And so it just naturally leads to us flipping and wholesaling more anyway. And again, puts us back to that, we're buying one every quarter or so that we're holding.
Two things on that. A, it's amazing that your average rehab is under 60. We can't even
Yeah.
touch. We can't even touch a $60,000 rehab. It feels like down here.
Oh man.
I have like a cosmetic one with new roof and HVAC that's running me like 75 right now.
Okay.
It's crazy.
What's the, if I can ask, what's the age of the property? Because I feel like that has a huge.
This one might be in the 90s.
Oh,
early
really? Okay.
2000s. It's in a planned neighborhood. It's a vinyl track home, but just our cost of labor down
That's
here
true. Right.
is skyrocketing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So pretty much like when I see a wholesaler send a deal through and it's $30,000 renovation, I can tell you're not renovating in Charleston because there's very few people who are doing a quality product. But the thing I want to talk about, you have a very specific criteria or buy box, and I think that's really important for people to understand. That's how you can prevent yourself from getting in trouble.
Right.
Is if it checks all the boxes that you know and understand and have experience with. Yes, there's still risk in every asset you ever buy and every tenant you put in the house, but you increase your likelihood of success by following your core competency on kind of what you guys need to own.
Yeah, I agree. And the reason I asked about age was, like I personally, I think, one of my partners is more open to it. Like I like things built after 1950 just because
Yeah.
there's more, there's more unknowns once you go to those older properties. So that's not like, I don't know that, one of my partners was buying before we, became a business. So I don't know that she owns anything pre 1945, maybe. But typically, everything else we're looking at is newer than that. And
Yeah.
again, it's like, it goes back to like those areas are usually rougher because those homes are not well maintained, and that's not where we're trying to hold stuff in. I mean, we wholesale there all the time, or you can even do a flip in the right neighborhood. But you're right, like those bigger rehabs are not something we target because the risk is higher. A 5% increase in a $100,000 rehab is more significant than like a $30,000
Yeah.
rehab. So, but yeah, we are lucky in the Midwest for our cost of labor to be probably significantly cheaper than the coastal markets. But then again, there's plenty of houses here where you can get upside down really quick as a seller, even if they're like, hey, I'll give you my house for 10K, because it needs so much work that those values, like that neighborhood might be $110,000 neighborhood. And so there's a lot
Yeah.
of deals that are just not worth messing with. And we've stopped targeting certain parts of the KC Metro just because, when those after repair values are sub 130, like it's unfortunate, but it doesn't make a lot of sense for an investor to go in there unless there's some kind of government incentive to go in there. Or if you're like, I mean, I'm not even gonna say this is a good strategy, but there's plenty of people who, take the slumlord strategy and they barely do any rehabs, which is not something I would ever condone. But like
Right.
that happens all the time, and those people may make those houses work. And we've been on the other side buying from them when they realize that's a terrible idea, and
Yeah.
they have to sell their house for super cheap or whatnot. But it's also the houses that we've seen like the worst living conditions. So again, like you said, a very specific buy criteria is really useful. And it's hard because when you're getting started, you don't want to like throw any deals out the door, or eliminate anything that could be a potential deal, but it just makes it so much easier. Your risk is so much lower when you do have a specific one.
Yeah. And your buy criteria is for what you buy personally. You
Right.
don't have to necessarily, everybody has different buy criteria. People
Yeah.
buy different stuff. If you can find buyers that like certain houses and are okay with these certain things, that's
Yeah.
their criteria. That's not your job to worry about that, which is important to understand. Yeah. The ARVs. Yeah. So I don't know that I'm trying to think. I don't even know that we have houses that really exist under 200 here at all anymore.
Right.
Even unless it's 600 square feet, maybe like a 1-1 in rough shape. I mean, it's
Right.
pretty. But fortunately, most of our homes are built 1950s and newer.
Yeah.
Unless you go into the historic parts like downtown Charleston. But fortunately, there you're talking 800 plus, $1,000 ARV. So you can have the money to renovate them, but they are probably year-long projects, and you have historical societies, and
Yeah.
like your paint's got to be approved, your wood's got to be approved, it can take 2 months just to get a permit. And that's part of knowing your market. We see virtual wholesalers come into Charleston all the time and try to, and they do, and it's in every market. You'll see it in Kansas City, you'll see it everywhere. They come into this area and they send you a house and you're like, there's no way it's worth that, or there's no way your renovation's even close. And I appreciate you pulling a house from a mile away that might have sold for something, but it's not even close to it.
Probably one of the most important things you can do when you're starting out is like understanding value. And it is difficult when you're virtual and don't really understand the neighborhoods, or maybe don't even have access. Like in Kansas, it's non-disclosure. So it's actually pretty hard to comp unless you have MLS access.
Yeah.
So yeah, you're absolutely right. Like don't ignore comps like, within a half mile just because there's a pretty nice one a mile away. And that's why I'm a big fan of, doing your back market as much as you can, because I know people who are successful in San Diego, LA, and that's probably one of the most competitive markets, in the country. So I think it's possible everywhere. It just may take you a little bit longer, but again, the fees are going to be bigger in those competitive markets. But being there makes a huge difference for us. Like meeting with sellers is kind of how, that's our competitive advantage for
Yeah.
sure over a virtual guy. But even a local, wholesaler, like whoever has the best appointment and can connect with the seller the most is probably going to get that deal. And, if you can solve their problems, like, that's the name of the game if you're going direct to seller. If you're using a team and buying from agents, like that's very possible. That agent can definitely do a lot of that heavy lifting for you, because they're going to understand the neighborhood and whatnot. But yeah, virtually wholesaling is tough. I would highly recommend you partner with a local wholesaler or investor, and then you can have that partnership go as long as you want until you feel comfortable. Like that's actually we went virtual into Indianapolis for a little bit, and we've kind of pulled it back just because it was strictly a wholesale market. And so it's harder to get opportunities that make sense because you're constantly having to go, the lowest possible offer so you can still make a profit. But again, we relied on somebody else because all the tools we had access to was still kind of difficult to pinpoint value. A lot of times, you find these comps and they would tell you like, oh no, that's an anomaly because of XYZ. And it's probably easier to figure out if you had that MLS access. So I like partnering with other folks when I get deals outside of our market, because we still get those deals on accident when we're marketing. And it just makes you a lot more confident, in my opinion, when you're making those offers, to make sure you're not messing it up or having to go back for a price reduction, because that's another thing we don't like to do, canceling or asking for price reductions. So, not everybody operates that way, but that's how we operate. Like we have a pretty low cancellation rate and a pretty low, price reduction, even though, we tell them there's an inspection period and all that other stuff. And, the typical stuff that you deal with a, MLS property, but we don't drag it out as long. We do everything pretty short and condensed, like I think most wholesalers do. So you just got to figure it out and be able to make those offers confidently.
Yeah. Man, that phone call, thankfully we haven't done it a bunch either in our business. The phone call of having to cancel a property or a price reduction, I think is one of the most gut-wrenching ones that I ever have to make. It is,
Yeah.
Especially if, they've gone down the line of potentially moving or have, depending on why they're selling the home, they've kind of come at peace with it.
Yeah.
And then to have it pulled from under them or changed is not enjoyable.
Yeah, I agree. And if you do this long enough, you have like probably a brand and a social media presence. And so like we're constantly building that up. And we don't want sellers to go on there and be like, hey, they just came back and lowballed me after their inspection period or something like that. And I do think there's some mentors and gurus or whatever you want to call them, coaches out there that teach that, like, just get under contract and then figure out where you need it after your buyers walk the property. I'm sure we've lost deals because we didn't take that approach, but I think we're okay with it because at the end of the day, like our reputation, especially in the Midwest, I feel like reputation and your word means a lot. Not saying that it doesn't in like California, but it's a smaller market. And so like you mentioned some folks that in Kansas City before we started recording, and I know them and you probably know a bunch of others too. And so you don't want your name to be out there like, oh, Ramon, he's the guy that just goes out there and locks deals up way too high and then there's retrades later. And, that to me probably means more than making a bunch of money. And I'm actually not the greatest at negotiating with sellers because I'm always trying to give them the best deal. And so I've had to replace myself in some of those conversations with one of my partners just because they can be a little bit more detached because maybe they didn't meet with the seller or whatnot. And so while we're still trying to run a profitable business, like you said, nobody wants to make those awkward phone calls when you're supposed to be providing, convenience, speed, and certainty. And now you're trying to, and again, I don't think it's bad when you do it really fast and at the beginning. Yeah. But I know plenty of people that have 30-day inspection windows and they're closing on the 31st day. And I'm like, you got to change that. Like, you don't want to do that to sellers. It's just not a good look.
Yeah, and it's also different. I've contracted a house telling them it's contingent. So we have crawl spaces here.
Yeah.
I know you guys have basements are a big thing. So our crawl spaces are a big thing. And I have lost, I remember there was one stretch last year, we lost like $38,000 in crawl space inspections, selling homes. And we thought we had remedied some stuff, and they found more stuff, and it was like back to back to back.
Right.
And so I have gotten to the point where I'm comfortable going in a crawl space. I also have my crawl space company will come do it. But there are certain homes, if I have a price and they have a price and we figure out something in between, I tell them this is based on your crawl space checking out the way that it should. I was like, because that's one thing that I know what roofs, HVACs, plumbing, electrical, I know what all that stuff costs. Anytime I think a crawl space is good, I've been hit for $7,000, $8,000, $9,000. And if you have those conversations up front, it's completely different when you call them and say, hey, this credible crawl space company went into your house. The repairs are going to be $9,000 because you have X, Y, and Z. How do we make this work now? So, and that's different than streaming them along for 30 days. And then what's cool about doing what you're supposed to do, so you kind of mentioned this a little earlier, there are people who do know marketing and just kind of referrals network. That's how our business is. So we do no direct to seller marketing. Nice. We've built a brand for ourselves, and then I've wrapped my truck, my wife's truck, and my 16-foot trailer, and we continuously get deals from it. I just got one a couple weeks ago, just sitting in a parking lot. A guy walked up to me, and then 2 days later was contracted.
Nice.
But because of that and doing what we're supposed to do, those people have led to referrals. And we're starting to see a chain of, hey, you bought my friend's house 6 months ago. They said everything went really smoothly. They told me to call you here. Our dumpster guy gives us referrals. Everybody now knows that we'll close. And so they call us before they call anybody else, which has made a big change as well.
Yeah. No, and those are the best deals. Like, nothing better than getting a free deal because, it makes everything a little bit less stressful. And yeah, I agree. And you would be the buyers that I would want to connect with if I was a wholesaler in that market, because you do what you say you're going to do. Like, I'd rather sell a deal to somebody I know is going to perform and assign it and know they're not going to come back like a day before closing and be like, I got no funding and now I have to figure out an extension, than make $5,000 more with some guy that I've never heard of. So like that's a huge deal. And again, if you're going to do this long term, you got to think about your reputation. I mean, there's plenty of people who are still in the business and they have a bad reputation, and they're probably doing deals too, but you're not going to get, like you said, all those referrals, all those free leads if you have a bad reputation.
Right. Yeah. So it's, again, it just goes back to just do it the right way in the beginning, and it will benefit you long term in your business, especially as you grow. If you think about it as a one-off transactional business, and it's a little bit different. But if it's something, you've been doing it now for 5-6 years. I think we've been doing it full time July 8. I mean, as you grow it's something that can benefit for a long time. Well, Ramon, I appreciate it, man. I had a good conversation with you. I don't know if there's anything else you want to leave the audience, but I thought you gave some really good information on people transitioning, buy and hold, and things like that.
No, I appreciate it. I'm happy to connect with anyone. I get a lot of DMs on Instagram about like getting started or like, what should I do with X amount of money? If you're in the Kansas City market, definitely love to connect with you. If you're thinking of investing out of state, or even if you're local, probably the best way to get a hold of me is probably on Instagram, which my Instagram handle is Ramon V_REI. And yeah, I'm pleasure being on here, and obviously a big fan of REsimpli and that software. We use it every day in our business, and we have a saying like, if it's not a REsimpli, it probably didn't happen.
That's
so
awesome.
like, yeah. So I mean, a good CRM is huge for any business for sure. But again, we didn't have REsimpli day one, right? Like, everybody starts somewhere, and I feel like, if you're like me, you're like slow and steady, you just constantly grow. But as you would say, like, the possibilities are kind of endless in real estate. There's a ton of way to make money. There's a ton of extra strategies. My biggest piece of advice is just focus on one.
Yeah, take action. I appreciate that. I mean, it is, and that's what Sherrod, so the founder of REsimpli, and we'll end it on this. He, we talk all the time, and what's his favorite book? What's the one thing that he talks about? And it's the one thing. Like that's one of his superpowers is being able to just dial in one thing at a time. And I've been a REsimpli user since its beginning, since I
Oh,
met
very nice.
Sherrod 5 years ago. Yeah, so I've been with it since the very beginning, and because of that focus on that, it's allowed it to grow to where it is now, and people's business will do the same thing by just having focus. So awesome, man. Well, I appreciate it. You guys connect with Ramon in Kansas City, and if you're ever up there, go eat some barbecue as well.
Yeah, definitely.